The water does not tell you its secrets at first glance. It looks calm, ordinary, a wide sheet of dark glass framed by the hills of northern Scotland. But if you linger by the shore long enough, the silence begins to bend. The ripples stretch in strange directions. The mist hovers just a little too thick, and you start to wonder if the lake itself is holding its breath. This isn't just a story about a monster. It's about why human beings are compelled to search for one. It's about our need to believe that the world still has hidden corners, that something vast and unseen might be moving beneath the surface while we go about our ordinary lives. I remember the first time I stood at the edge of Loch Ness. The air smelled faintly of peat and cold stone, and the horizon was blurred in a veil of fog. A fisherman's boat drifted far away, its engine cutting the water with a rhythm that echoed like a slow heartbeat. And for a moment, in the distance, I thought I saw a curve, just the suggestion of something breaking the skin of the water before vanishing again. My rational mind said it was a trick of the light, but my heart refused to let it go. Stories like this one have a way of living inside us, asking questions we never fully answer. And that is what we do here, inside the secret box. If you find yourself drawn to mysteries, to the quiet thrill of the unexplained, then you belong with us. Take a moment now to subscribe to the Secret Box, and let's walk deeper together into this strange, enduring tale. Because what waits in Loch Ness is more than a legend. It is a mirror reflecting our hopes, our doubts, and our longing for the extraordinary. I learned quickly that mysteries do not begin with thunderclaps. They enter through small doors. In a village that leans toward the lake like a listener, a shopkeeper slid a tin box across the counter and told me to look inside. Paper smelled like rain that had dried a century ago. A slip from a traveler noted an animal that moved like rope pulled beneath a drum. Then the sentence frayed into a coffee stain and a burn mark, as if time itself had gotten impatient. A faded ledger listed unusual catches from the water. Nothing extraordinary, just fluctuations. A week of nets coming up heavy with eels that twisted like black punctuation. I copied the dates and wondered whether a pattern hid there, whether a lake's memory could be translated into our own. An old woman in a seaside cafe poured tea that steamed up toward her eyes. She didn't speak in claims, she offered fragments. A cousin who heard a splash no weather could explain. A road where headlights once caught a shape that seemed to curve out of the road's logic and back into the dark. She shrugged, as if to say that life near water teaches you which questions to keep. Her story did not ask to be believed. It asked to be carried. In the ruins of a small church, I brushed moss off a stone sill and found initials cut by a hand that must have hoped to be remembered. Beside those initials, a scratched line of Gaelic that I could not read but could feel, the insistence of someone trying to leave a thread for the next wanderer. No grand proclamations, no carved beasts. Just the human urge to say, I was here, and the water was here, and something between us moved. When the modern world finally turned its face toward Loch Ness, it didn't come as a revelation, it came as a tension. Newspapers discovered how the surface of the story could be as glossy as the lake itself. Editors learned that the right headline could ripple all the way to breakfast tables and classrooms, that a single image could do what a lifetime of patient observation might never accomplish. Expectations gathered like weather. If you tell people to look for a curve breaking the water, they will meet you halfway and find a curve in their memory, even when the lake offers only crosswinds. But there were moments. There are always moments. At dawn one spring, before tourists unzipped tents and checked their phones, a bus driver pulled over to sip coffee and watch the mist thread itself between the hills. He knew this road as well as he knew the lines on his palm. The lake lay long and dark as if it were resting. Then a set of ripples came from nowhere, a deliberate line that traveled wrong, not fanning outward like the wake of a boat, not answering wind. He blinked, and the line became 3 low mounds riding just beneath the surface, the way a hand moves under a blanket. He did not chase it. He stood still and tried to behave like a camera. By the time he got back in the bus, his coffee was cold, and he had learned a quiet fact. An event can be real and also resist explanation. One July afternoon, a couple parked in a lay-by and argued with the friendly intensity of people who have been together long enough to know that love sometimes borrows the shape of bickering. The argument paused when the water out there folded upward. Their word for it later was folded, as if the surface had tried to become a page. Sunlight caught the ridge of it and made a brief silver spine. She said it had weight. He said it was a wind trick. They both leaned on the railing and waited for a second proof that never arrived. On the drive home, they let the radio fill the silence and said a little less than usual, because part of them did not want the moment to belong to language at all. A teenager on the hillside with binoculars tried to teach his heart to keep a scientist's pace. He traced boats and logged their wakes. He learned how distance flattens and exaggerates in the same breath. He learned that waves collaborate to build illusions no single wave could make. One afternoon, the water offered him a shape that traveled with a surprising steadiness, like a fish on a path it had made for itself. He followed it with slow breaths and waited for his mind to sharpen into a conclusion. The shape resolved into a line of birds at rest, feathered bodies making a dotted sentence on the lake. He laughed, not because the mystery had died, but because it had taught him to be more precise. After that, he looked harder and loved the lake more. These accounts refuse to be sorted neatly into true and false. They live in a region we don't have many maps for, the region where a person's perception, the weather's small mistakes, and a body of water's language intersect. I found myself coming back to the same idea. If there is a creature here, it is large enough to slip between our categories and small enough to let doubt speak. If there isn't, then the lake has still managed to create a phenomenon that behaves like a creature in our minds. Either way, the story swims. There is an image that sits behind much of what the world thinks it knows, grainy, suggestive, the silhouette of a neck that might be a neck or might be a story, deciding what shape it wants. The photograph traveled further than any boat on the Loch. It printed itself onto lunch counters and posters, onto the soft room of a child's curiosity, onto the hard surfaces of skeptical talk shows. When it was later questioned, revised, reinterpreted, the image did not curl up and die. It changed the conversation, and then survived the conversation that changed it. I thought about how a picture is less a record than a contract between the seen and the seer, and how contracts outlast their authors. If the image was a spark, the search that followed was the long burn. I joined a small team one late autumn, the kind of night when breath hangs in front of a face like a thought that hasn't decided what it wants to be. The boat pushed out into water that held darkness like a secret it had practiced. The sonar hummed and painted its patient rows along the screen, translating depth into a blue language. The lake's floor rose and fell in gentle hills that no human foot would ever touch. Each pass gave us a map, and each map asked for another pass. What I noticed first was not excitement, but patience. The captain's hands moved along the rail like someone reading Braille. A graduate student wrapped in too many scarves marked coordinates with a pencil because her body trusted graphite more than batteries at 2 a.m. A mechanic who didn't say much listened to the engine the way a parent listens to a child who has learned a new word. They were a small nation tied together by curiosity and thermoses. When the screen blipped with something denser than the surroundings, no one shouted. They breathed. The captain circled back. The sonar drew the line again. Anomaly, yes, but the lake offers many. Data does not assemble itself into meaning until you lay patience over it like tracing paper. On shore, a different team watched the surface with infrared, the camera turning temperature into a kind of ghostless glow. Their notebooks were neat with times and wind speeds, with the direction of the fetch and the behavior of distant boats whose wakes could arrive minutes later and pretend to be something else. Even there, with technology stacked like scaffolding, I felt the old humility rise. No matter how carefully we instrument the world, mystery maintains the right to vote. During a quiet hour before dawn, I walked the pier and learned the temperature of wood under cold stars. A thermocline lay somewhere below, a boundary between waters of different moods, and it occurred to me that the lake has its own architecture. Rooms layered upon rooms, some with doors that open and close according to weather, that will never check our schedules. Walking back, I noticed something low in the water before it dissolved into the sum of its ripples. Not a revelation, an invitation. I accepted by staying. The lake itself deserves the kind of attention we usually reserve for protagonists. It is long beyond the patience of a casual eye, narrow in a way that makes wind work harder. The water runs dark with peat, so that visibility becomes philosophy. You see a little and imagine the rest. Waves here travel with unusual discipline, marching in trains that hide their leaders. Crosswinds interview them and sometimes persuade them to say things they don't mean. A floating log graduates to a rumor with the right rehearsal. When distant boats cut the surface, their wakes do not always announce themselves immediately. They travel, combine, and perform at new locations, creating moving ridges that seem to have intentions. If you have ever watched a crowd from a balcony and seen how a single motion becomes a choreography, you can imagine what waves do when no one is asking them to be honest. There are the long pulses, seiches, that make a lake breathe as if attached to the planet's hidden lungs. There are standing waves that rise in place with a confidence that can pretend to be alive. There are thermals that lift and sink debris in cycles we read as appearances and disappearances. On some days, wind presses its thumb against the surface and writes in cursive. On other days, the water erases itself and begins again. When locals say the lake plays tricks, I do not hear deception. I hear a complex system conducting a classroom with too many variables for any one student to track. But even complexity has limits, and my mind kept returning to the possibility that a biological answer might swim through this mathematics. Eels, for instance, can grow large enough to feel mythic if you meet one on its own terms. Their movement is a signature, a wave that travels down the body with patient economy, a long sentence written without punctuation until the eel decides to breathe air and add a comma. Imagine such bodies moving near the surface at night, how a line of them could become a story you tell the next day. Sturgeon, armored and prehistorically handsome, visit coastal and inland waters on schedules that do not consult us. If one rolled and exposed a back in weak light, our minds might supply a creature we were primed to meet. There are seals whose heads can look, at the right distance and angle, like something that has heard its own legend and agreed to perform a cameo. Otters leave trails of bubbles and jokes. Birds at rest form just enough geometry to mimic a segmented back if your heart is ahead of your eyes. Each candidate, examined closely, asks as many questions as it answers. A giant eel suggests a population. A population suggests sightings more numerous and consistent than we have. A stray sturgeon suggests a movement corridor. The corridor suggests evidence along it. But absence of evidence will never equal evidence of absence, and that hole in logic is where mystery builds its house. We live in that house more often than we admit. Back with the team, I listened to stories that were not trying to be stories. The mechanic told me about a night when the propeller caught weeds that felt like hands and made a sound that turned men into children. The graduate student remembered a sequence of sonar marks, stacked like vertebrae until a boat passed and rearranged them into noise. The captain confessed that the lake had taught him two opposite virtues at once, skepticism and tenderness. Both, he said, are forms of respect. You might imagine that disappointment is the most common feeling during a search like this. It isn't. The dominant moods are steadiness and something I can only call gratitude, the kind you feel when you realize that looking itself is a privilege. On a good night, the lake gives you patterns you did not know how to see the week before. On a great night, it gives you an almost. The almost is a silver coin that glints at the bottom of the fountain and keeps you tossing more wishes. Near the end of that autumn, a rumor moved along the shore that someone had seen a disturbance marching against the wind. It is remarkable how fast a rumor can learn to walk. We gathered near a point where the land shoulders into the water and waited for confirmation. What we got was a lesson in scale. Waves that looked bold at distance dissolved into modesty as they reached our boots. The anomaly lost its accent and spoke like any other ripple. We did not call it failure because the lake had not promised us success. We called it practice. We logged what we saw and added it to the quiet library where searchers shelved their days. Nights like that have a way of sharpening a person, like a whetstone taken to a blade that cuts nothing but certainty. I found myself thinking less about proving and more about attending. The story of a creature here is also the story of how humans approach the unknown, with instruments and with instincts, with the hunger of childhood and the discipline of craft. I began to see why the myth endures whether or not a large body is moving under the surface. The endurance says something about us, that we prefer a world with corridors we haven't walked, that awe is not a luxury, but a basic nutrient. If you stay long enough, the lake starts telling you what not to trust. It tells you not to trust the first interpretation if it is too satisfying. It tells you not to trust your eyes if your heart has already written the caption. It tells you not to trust exhaustion when it starts speaking in sentences that end with periods instead of question marks. And yet, it also tells you what to keep. A late ripple when the wind has died, a pattern that repeats on non-consecutive days, a disturbance that moves with coherence rather than explosion. It trains you to hold two thoughts at once without tearing, that nature can produce wonders without intention, and that not every wonder is the same. By winter, I had learned where the road pulls closest to the shore and where the shore stands back with arms crossed. I had learned which stones along the path keep warm longer after the sun drops, and which pubs hold a silence that listens back. In one such place, a man with weather around his eyes described a winter morning when steam rose from the lake and created columns that looked for a few beats like living pillars. He didn't push the image toward a creature. He let it lift and vanish. Then he said this, and I carry it because it felt like a lesson you could use anywhere. There is a difference between seeing a thing and wanting to have seen a thing. Most errors are born in the second. The next phase of the search would bring new tools and with them new kinds of humility. But before that, the lake had one more gift to offer, a night that asked for nothing but attention and gave back more than evidence ever could. By the time modern eyes turned their focus with new devices, the story had already grown roots in the soil of culture. Yet every fresh attempt at certainty carried its own flavor of suspense. I remember walking into a makeshift operations room where cables coiled like patient snakes on the floor and screens glowed with faint outlines of data. Here the lake was not water, but a series of readings, a mosaic of dots and gradients. The hum of machines was steady, almost meditative, as if they too were listening. The team spoke in quiet tones, because volume feels almost disrespectful when you're trying to coax secrets out of the unseen. A drone lifted into the air, its rotors drumming against the silence of dawn. On the monitor, the lake's surface became a quilt of grays, mist trailing across it like breath. Patterns appeared, boat wakes, bird shadows, atmospheric noise. Somewhere among them, the watchers hoped, might emerge a shape that refused the usual explanations. What struck me most was not discovery, but discipline. They cataloged everything. A bird circling, logged, a log drifting half-sunk, logged, a cluster of waves collapsing in unison, logged. Their notebooks became a scripture of doubt and patience, and woven into that scripture was a truth you could feel even if no anomaly appeared. Sometimes the act of recording is itself the point. The mystery doesn't always need to be solved. Sometimes it just needs witnesses who care enough to pay attention. When environmental DNA sampling came into play, the story gained another texture. Tubes of water were lifted, sealed, labeled with precision. Invisible fragments of life, cells, scales, residues, would be read later in distant laboratories. Scientists explained that a lake carries the signatures of its residents like a book carries the fingerprints of every reader. By sifting through the water's DNA, you could reconstruct a roll call of who had passed through. Eels, salmon, trout, plankton, yes. But something unexpected? That was the question waiting at the end of every sequence. Results trickled back with the tone of riddles. Nothing conclusive, nothing theatrical. A heavy presence of eels, perhaps larger than expected. No definitive sign of something prehistoric, yet no closure either. The data answered one question while breeding three more. Standing by the shore when these results were discussed, I realized that science too participates in the theater of the unknown. It gives us sharper tools, but the silence at the heart of the mystery remains. There was a night I returned alone, away from teams and instruments, to sit by the water as if the lake and I had a private appointment. The hills loomed darker than the sky, the surface calm enough to mirror constellations. My breath slowed until I could hear the subtle lapping of tiny waves against stone, like a hand stirring beads in a bowl. Hours passed. Then, far out, something shifted. A ripple moved with intention, not the wide scatter of wind, not the chaotic tumble of wakes. It rolled forward as though pulled by a hidden arm. I leaned forward, every muscle listening. The ripple carried itself a dozen yards, then dissolved into silence as if it had never been. In that vanishing, I felt the essence of Loch Ness, a gift of ambiguity. Enough to startle the senses, not enough to end the conversation. The lake seemed to whisper that certainty is a luxury we rarely earn, and that mystery, carefully tended, may be the richer inheritance. I thought then of what it would mean if tomorrow someone produced irrefutable evidence. A carcass hauled ashore, a living specimen documented beyond dispute. The myth would collapse into fact, and with fact would come both triumph and grief. Triumph, because wonder had proved tangible. Grief, because the endless space of possibility would shrink. We would know, and knowing is often the end of dreaming. And if, instead, it is proven there is nothing, that every ripple was only log, bird, wave, illusion, the story would not die. It would migrate into memory, into metaphor. We would still tell it, not as evidence but as parable, a reminder that humans hunger for the uncharted, that imagination itself is a form of survival. The longer I sat there, the more I understood that this mystery was not housed in the lake alone. It was housed in us, our need to believe, our willingness to doubt, our capacity to carry a story even when it resists conclusion. Loch Ness is a body of water, yes, but it is also a mirror. What we see moving beneath its surface depends, in part, on what moves within our own depths. The final hours before dawn stretched soft and unbroken. A breeze lifted, painting ripples across the reflection of stars. Somewhere across the lake, a bird cried, its echo bent by distance into something stranger than its origin. I let the sound drift into me, and I thought of the first voice that ever whispered about a creature here. That voice had long since vanished into history, but the echo endured. And as I rose to leave, I felt what countless seekers before me must have felt, that it does not matter whether the monster is flesh and bone or story and shadow. What matters is that it reminds us the world still holds secrets, and that sometimes the most faithful thing we can do is to let a question remain a question. The water was calm again when I took my last look, calm but never empty. The kind of calm that promises another ripple someday, another story, another searcher standing at the edge, wondering what else might live beneath the skin of the ordinary. And in that quiet, I realized that is the true secret of Loch Ness, not a beast hidden in its depths, but the part of ourselves that keeps returning, hoping to see more than what is already known. In the morning, the lake wore a different face. The way a person looks changed after a long conversation. I walked the narrow road that keeps company with the shoreline, and watched the water practice its languages. Wind from the southwest pressed a diagonal script across the surface. Where the hills funneled that wind, lines formed, parallel and purposeful, like the grain in old wood. Out beyond them, a patch of water went oddly smooth, the way a crowd sometimes hushes in the middle of noise. If you'd shown me a photograph of that smoothness out of context, I might have sworn it was a creature's back. In person, the air explained it. Streaks of Langmuir circulation sorting foam into lanes, invisible fingers raking the surface. Nature has a gift for choreography that looks like intent. In the village, a cafe opened its door to steam and chatter. The owner knew the names of the regulars' boots. On one wall, a pinboard held flyers for Sileys and rowing clubs and a charity run that traced the shoreline. Beneath them, a child's drawing, not of a monster exactly, but of a long curve with a friendly eye and a line of boats that looked like commas. Next to the drawing, a coin jar for a local rescue service. The caption in a careful hand, "If you see something, be safe and tell a grown-up." The lake, distilled into a lesson. Across from the cafe, a shop displayed mugs and t-shirts and carved wooden curves that could be anything you wanted. I went in expecting kitsch and found something gentler. Alongside the souvenirs sat photographs the owner's father had taken. Winter mornings when steam pillars rose like a procession. A summer dusk where the lake matched the sky so precisely that the horizon disappeared and boats seemed to float on nothing. The owner watched me look and said simply, "It keeps us here." He did not have to say what he meant. The mystery paid bills, yes, but it also tied lives to place, gave rhythm to seasons, gave someone a reason to stay when the cities sang their bright songs. At a small hotel, the guest book rested on a stand with the dignity of an altar. People had written about anniversaries, pilgrimages, promises made in the private rooms of their hearts. Tucked in one page, I found a note folded like a secret. "We came hoping to see something we can't explain. We leave with more questions than answers and somehow feel richer." I thought of the tin box the shopkeeper had slid across the counter days ago, the smell of old paper, The traveler's phrase about rope pulled beneath a drum. Patterns repeat, not because the world is small, but because certain desires are ancient. That afternoon, I sat with a librarian who knew the lake by its footnotes. She brought out a stack of local papers that charmed me with their headlines, plain words that leaned toward wonder without falling in. Together we traced years when sightings seemed to cluster, then fade, then flare. When we overlaid those clusters with records of weather and tourism, we found correlations that were not the same as causes. A summer with unusual winds produced a rash of reports. A year with a new road and more lay-bys put more eyes on the water and delivered more stories. And yet, within those swells of attention, a few reports refused to behave like noise. They appeared on days without wind, in places away from boat traffic, witnessed by people who had long practiced not fooling themselves. Outliers, yes. But often the most interesting truths live where the graph looks lonely. In the evening, a local guide took me to a point where the current pinch is said to turn tricky when the river and the loch argue. He told me about a winter when the surface sheathed itself in a skin so thin you could mistake it for light, and how the first boat of morning rode a quick wound through it that healed as soon as the wake passed. He smiled and said, "The lake is an excellent liar," then corrected himself. "No, not a liar, a poet. It tells the truth sideways." Back on the water with the team, the conversation turned more technical in a way that did not ruin the romance. Side-scan sonar painted the lakebed with texture, showing the silted shapes of old logs, the rubble fields left by long-ago landslides, the drifts where debris gathers. Multibeam gave us beautiful geometry, a fan of beams sweeping in arcs. We learned the lake's interior landscape the way you learn a friend's house in the dark, where the steps creak, where the temperature changes, where the ceiling drops a little lower than expected. When an anomaly appeared, an elongated return, a denser patch, the boat passed again at a different angle. Sometimes the anomaly sharpened, as if turning its face. Sometimes it dissolved into a pattern the first pass had exaggerated. It felt like talking to a shy witness. A data scientist from the city visited with a laptop and models she was proud of and skeptical about in equal measure. She'd trained a classifier on hours of surface footage to flag unusual disturbances. The first demos were thrilling and humbling. The model was superb at birds and boats and driftwood. It lit up its seals like a child at a birthday cake. Then it started seeing intent where there was none. A line of converging waves became something with a spine. Two synchronized wakes looked like articulation. We watched the errors and learned. It wasn't that the algorithm was foolish. It was that it was too much like us, good at finding the shapes we tell it to look for. She tweaked thresholds and we tweaked our expectations. Progress looked like the slow shedding of wishful thinking. We sent samples to the lab again. The eDNA results came back as if the lake were listing its tenants at a town meeting. Salmon, trout, char, pike, a choir of microlife, and, echoing the ledger I'd read in that tin box, eel after eel. Not a smoking gun. More like a humility pill. If you were to imagine a long-bodied movement cutting the surface on a dim evening, eels could wear that suit convincingly. But to grow to the size some stories imply would require a lottery of biology we haven't yet seen here. The scientist shrugged at the numbers with a respect that looked like affection. The lake was reminding us that answers are rarely one syllable. On a rain-streaked day, a man invited me into his workshop to see a boat he was repairing. The hull bore scratches from decades of work, a biography written in shallow scars. He asked what I'd found, and I told him the truth. More patience than proofs. He nodded and told me about a memory he did not parade for tourists. He had been young, the light had been strange, and something had moved with a steadiness that belonged to a living thing. He protected that memory not because he needed to persuade anyone of anything, but because it felt like a gift meant for him. I realized then that many people around the lake carry a private version of the tale, closer to warmth than to argument. If you listen respectfully, they will share it. If you come to win, they will let you tire yourself out and keep the best parts for quieter company. The rhythm of the search grew into a habit. Mornings of surface watching, afternoons of instruments, evenings of debriefs where laughter was common and conclusions rare. We started to pay attention to negative space, the times when nothing happened and what those times taught. We learned that the sun's angle at certain hours can erase texture and make every ripple look like a line drawn by a patient hand. We learned that kestrels cast moving commas that, in peripheral vision, pretend to be dorsal narrative. We admitted the limits of our eyes and borrowed each other's. There was a day when everything aligned: clear air, low wind, the lake in a cooperative mood. A call came from a lay-by we recognized. A couple had seen a series of humps moving against the wave pattern. The phrase humps made everyone cautious. It is the word that hangs in the air like bait. We reached the spot quickly, instruments ready, eyes sharper for being fed with hope. On the surface, a chain of rises moved with coherence. I felt that old thrum in the chest, the one that makes time go both fast and slow. Then a breeze shifted. The chain lost its order and revealed itself as a partial reflection and the wake of a boat we couldn't see yet, rounding a far bend. The couple apologized for sounding dramatic. We apologized for arriving like a cavalry. We all laughed, because laughter is a ceremony that lets disappointment drain without leaving a stain. I kept thinking about the phrase I'd copied from the traveler's note: rope pulled beneath a drum. If you stand far enough back, a wind line crossing the loch really does look like a rope tugged under taut skin. But there was a tenderness in the way that note was written that made me hesitate to flatten it into explanation. Maybe the traveler knew as much and wrote it anyway, choosing a simile that honored what he felt more than what he could claim. That's the part of the story that critics sometimes miss. Most people who share these moments are not trying to win. They are trying to keep a feeling alive without imprisoning it in certainty. The months turned, the hills changed their green. Tourist buses came like long breaths and left like long breaths. Children pointed from windows and made shapes with their hands against the glass. The lake accepted all of it: the basement of curiosity, the commerce, the skepticism that sometimes sounded like pride in being hard to fool. In a town hall meeting about shoreline protections, the monster was not on the agenda and yet present in every sentence. It lurked inside the reasons to preserve clarity, to manage boat wakes, to keep the night dark enough for stars to matter. A myth, even if only a myth, can be a fine steward of real places. I met a teacher who took her students to the water with notebooks and asked them to write what they noticed for 10 quiet minutes, then to write what they noticed the second 10 and then the third. The third page, she said, is where the good observations begin. The first is full of guesses, the second, lull, the third, the world starts to reveal itself. She was not teaching them to find a creature. She was teaching them how to see without rushing to own what they saw. Some of those children would leave for cities where mysteries glow on screens and answer themselves in seconds. But maybe, she hoped, they would carry this slower way of looking like a compass. One night, late, a fog formed with unusual speed and did the old magician's trick of making familiar things vanish. The water flattened and became an ear, a single organ listening to the breeze. I heard a sound like a breath drawn through teeth, and then a soft slap, as if something long had turned lazily near the surface. I moved to the edge, useless as a camera without light. Nothing presented itself, and I felt no urge to force the moment into a confession. Instead, I took inventory of what I knew: a thermocline somewhere below, eels in unromantic abundance, the habits of wind here, the patience of logs, the echo of boats that wear other boats as masks. And then I took inventory of what I didn't know, most of it. Uncertainty, I realized, can be a form of intimacy. It keeps you close. If there is a lesson in months by this lake, it is not that monsters are real, or that they are not. It is that searching, when done with care, changes the searcher. You become suspicious of easy narratives. You become generous with people whose experiences don't fit your own. You learn to hold an image without enslaving it to your need for finality. And, perhaps, you learn to love places for their refusal to be simple. I began to imagine 2 endings and found that neither satisfied me. In one, we catch the creature with cameras and measurements, and the world cheers while a smaller, private world goes a little quiet. In the other, we prove absence and go home tidy, and later that night, alone in the kitchen, feel a lack we can't name. Better, I thought, to keep the endings as doorways and let the story walk past them into whatever tomorrow brings. Another ripple, another misread wave, another child drawing a curve with a friendly eye. On my last morning for a while, I returned to the place where I had first thought I saw a curve lift and vanish. The light was different, sharper, the kind that makes edges click into place. A breeze lifted and the water practiced its little inventions. Across from me, a bus eased onto the shoulder. A driver stepped down with a paper cup and leaned against the rail, the way a man leans when he knows he has a minute and wants to spend it entirely. I wondered if he would see anything. I hoped he would, and I hoped he wouldn't. Both wishes were honest. Both belonged here. As I left, I paused by the cafe. The child's drawing had been replaced by a new one, the same long curve, now with stars above it, and a moon that had learned to smile. The caption in the careful hand had changed too. It said simply, "Keep looking kindly." I thought that might be the best advice the lake had ever given me. The lake is not the only archive of this mystery. People are the other. I began visiting homes, libraries, even roadside pubs, not to ask for proof, but to ask what the story meant. That shift, away from evidence toward meaning, opened doors. In one stone house near Inverness, a man showed me his grandfather's diary. Between entries about sheep prices and weather patterns, there was a line so brief it almost vanished. Saw something in the loch. Long, silent. No drawing, no embellishment, no attempt to persuade. The restraint made it more haunting. The grandson explained that his grandfather was a man who measured words like coins. If he wrote it, he believed he'd seen it, but he never spoke of it aloud. In silence, the story grew larger than any retelling. In a school gymnasium turned community hall, elders gathered to play cards. When I asked about the monster, laughter rippled through the room, not derisive but affectionate, like teasing an old friend. Then one woman, white hair pinned in a knot, leaned forward. She described slowly a dawn walk in the 1960s when the loch was glass and the sky pink. Out in the middle, she swore she saw 3 arcs rise in sequence, as if a spine were lifting itself to breathe. She admitted she could not prove it, but the memory still lived inside her body, a chord that vibrated whenever she saw the loch in stillness. As she spoke, the laughter faded, and the card players listened the way one listens to a hymn. The more I listened, the more I realized. This creature, whether it exists or not, has already left tracks in human minds. It lives in drawings, diaries, confessions, and even silence. It is not only aquatic, it is psychological. That's why it survives when other legends fade. I walked the shoreline with a historian who argued that Nessie's real body was not in the water, but in the economy. He gestured toward hotels, tour boats, souvenir stalls. "Look," he said, "this town is standing on her back. She feeds us as surely as fish used to." He wasn't cynical, he was admiring. He saw in the myth a form of collective authorship. Thousands of storytellers weaving a beast into being every time they bought a postcard or booked a room. But then he paused, softened his tone, and told me something else. His own father, a pragmatic farmer, had once returned home pale, unable to explain what he'd seen on the loch. He never mentioned it again. That silence, the historian said, paid for my skepticism, but it also protected my wonder. I started to notice how the lake teaches contradictions. Scientists here practice precision, yet they admit mystery with a shrug that doesn't diminish their rigor. Locals sell trinkets with a smile, then share private stories with reverence. Children sketch friendly serpents, while grown men measure wakes in meters per second. Each approach contradicts the others, yet all belong. On a clear night, I lay on the hillside with a notebook. The stars scattered above mirrored the loch below, and I thought, perhaps this is the truest shape of the legend. Not a creature, but a constellation. You connect points across time and imagination, and suddenly there is form where before there were only fragments. Nessie is less an animal than a pattern we cannot stop drawing. And in that moment, I understood the deeper tie. The Loch Ness Monster is not just Scotland's myth, it is humanity's rehearsal of longing. We need to believe that there is still something out there that has not been catalogued, named, or explained away. We need to believe that when we stand at the edge of the known, something might ripple in the unknown and remind us that the world is larger than our nets. The lake kept teaching me in whispers. A log drifting at dusk became an essay on perception. A sudden wave in calm water became a poem about how reality bends. Even the stillness, especially the stillness, was instruction. Not everything speaks in evidence. Some things speak in absence. As I prepared to leave, I felt the paradox settle in me. To solve the mystery would be to shrink it, To leave it unsolved is to let it keep feeding our imagination. Maybe that is why the story persists, why the photographs and diaries and whispered recollections never lose their grip. Because Nessie, real or not, represents the hope that there are still doors unmarked on our maps. And perhaps the truest gift the Loch gives us is not a monster at all, but a discipline, to look harder, to doubt kindly, to believe carefully, and to carry mystery not as a burden, but as a lantern. I began to realize that the longer I stayed with this story, the more it stopped being about the outline of a creature and started being about the outline of us. Every culture leaves fingerprints on its mysteries, and Loch Ness has become a kind of mirror, reflecting not only shapes in the water, but the shapes of our fears, our faiths, our hunger for wonder. One evening, sitting with a psychologist from Edinburgh who'd come not to hunt monsters, but to study the hunters, I learned a new way of seeing the Loch. She said that belief itself behaves like a current, invisible, powerful, pulling people together or apart. When people report a sighting, she explained, they're not just telling us about what they saw. They're telling us about what they needed to see. That idea unsettled me at first. Was she reducing wonder to wish? But the more I listened, the more I understood. A sighting can be both an external event and an internal revelation. The two are not enemies. They are partners. I thought back to the woman who remembered the three arcs rising in dawn light and how her body still carried the vibration decades later. Her experience was not diminished by the possibility of waves or debris. The truth was that her memory had become a kind of private scripture, teaching her how to feel awe in ordinary mornings. What if Nessie's greatest gift is not biological, but psychological? A training in how to let mystery live alongside daily life. Science has its own poetry in this regard. I joined a group of young researchers who compared the Loch Ness phenomenon to apophenia, the human tendency to find patterns where none exist. They spoke of constellations. We draw hunters and bears in the sky out of scattered dots, not because the stars demand it, but because we do. Loch Ness, they suggested, is a constellation on water. We connect ripples, shadows, and wakes into the outline of a creature, and then that outline feeds us in return. But one of the students, half laughing at his own boldness, added, and just because we invented the pattern doesn't mean nothing is there. Maybe the truth wears the mask of our imagination to survive. That thought stayed with me as I wandered the shoreline at night. If the monster is real, it has hidden itself perfectly. If it is not real, it has still conquered time and space by living in our minds. Either way, it is one. Culture here thrives on that ambiguity. The myth pays wages and fills rooms, yes, but it also keeps alive a certain humility in the face of the unknown. I watched as a child clutched a stuffed Nessie in one hand, while listening to her father explain sonar readouts in the other. She was learning that science and wonder are not opposites. They are companions on the same road, asking different questions of the same silence. And then I thought, perhaps this is why Loch Ness endures when other mysteries fade. It is not just a story of a monster in a lake. It is a story of how humans negotiate with mystery itself, how we balance the need for proof with the need for awe, how we live inside questions that never fully close. On my final night, the loch offered a scene so quiet it felt staged by something older than memory. Mist clung low, the hills hunched like watchmen, and the water was as still as an eye before it blinks. I heard a faint stirring, a soft line of ripples that moved against the stillness, deliberate yet unhurried. It vanished almost as soon as I noticed. I stood there, unsure whether to label it wind, animal, or illusion. And in that hesitation, I found peace. Because the essence of Loch Ness is not to give answers, but to keep us asking. When I walked away, I did not feel empty-handed. I felt full of stories, of silences, of images that would not resolve. The monster remained unseen, but mystery itself had shown its face. And perhaps that is the real creature that lives here, not in the water, but in us. If one day the world woke to a headline that read, "Confirmed, the Loch Ness Monster exists," what would change? Cameras would flood the shoreline, helicopters would sweep above, scientists would converge with nets and trackers. The discovery would be hailed as proof that our planet still hides marvels beyond our charts. A living relic, a body older than our histories, would remind us that extinction is not always final, that survival sometimes wears disguises. The economic boon would be immense, the cultural shock profound. For a few brief weeks, humanity would share a rare common wonder. And yet, the moment certainty arrived, something else would die. The mystery that had stretched across centuries would collapse into a specimen with measurements and taxonomy. Museums would hold its bones. Papers would argue about its DNA. The creature would become past tense. Children would no longer draw arcs with friendly eyes, but instead copy the outlines from biology textbooks. The story would be finished, and finished stories rarely walk with us as long as unfinished ones do. Now, imagine the opposite. Conclusive evidence that nothing unusual inhabits the loch. Every sonar sweep, every DNA sample, every expedition aligning into a verdict of emptiness. Would the world shrug? Perhaps. But would the story end? No. Because the Loch Ness Monster has already slipped its tether to biology. It lives now in art, in folklore, in the hopeful bend of perception. Declaring it unreal would be like declaring that constellations aren't really bears or hunters. Of course they aren't. And yet, we go on tracing them across the sky. The deeper truth is that both outcomes, proof of existence or proof of absence, would miss the point. The monster has already done its work. It has taught generations to look harder at water, to listen longer to silence, to admit that the unknown still breathes beside us. It has trained us in patience, in doubt, in wonder. Its body may be uncertain, but its lessons are real. On my last dawn at the loch, the surface was unbroken, a mirror for a pale sky. I thought of every person who had stood here before me, the bus driver with his cold coffee, the couple with their silver spine of water, the old woman with her dawn memory, the farmer with his silence. Their stories wove together, not into proof, but into a tapestry of human longing, and I realized that the monster itself is less important than the way we gather around it, telling stories that outlast photographs, weaving meaning from ripples. As the sun crept higher, the mist dissolved and the hills grew sharp again. The loch lay still, offering nothing and everything at once. I whispered a quiet thank you to the water, to the myth, to the mystery that had walked with me, and I understood that leaving without an answer was not failure. It was the point, because some secrets are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be carried. And as I turned from the shore, I carried Loch Ness with me, not as a monster in the water, but as a reminder that wonder itself is alive, and that as long as we keep looking, the world will never run out of mysteries. As I stepped away from the water, I felt the weight of silence settle not as an absence but as a companion. The loch did not confess, did not betray itself, did not give me what so many come here hoping to take home. Instead, it gave something rarer, a reminder that mystery itself is a living thing. It breathes in the spaces between explanation and imagination. It survives every attempt to cage it, and it follows you long after you leave the shoreline. I walked the narrow road that curved along the water's edge. Behind me, the lake exhaled, a low ripple brushing against stone, as though it wanted to remind me one last time, I am not here to be solved. I am here to make you remember what it feels like to wonder. And perhaps that is the truest secret tucked inside the secret box tonight. That the most enduring monsters are not born of flesh and scale, but of our longing to believe there is still more than meets the eye. So, if you carry anything with you after this hour, let it be this. The world is wide, and its mysteries are patient. Keep a space in yourself for the unexplained, not to fear it, not to master it, but to walk beside it. The Loch Ness Monster may never rise from the depths to prove itself, but the hope that it might, that single, impossible hope, is what keeps us searching, keeps us curious, keeps us alive to wonder. And in that sense, Nessie is real, real enough to echo across time, real enough to make us gather here together, real enough to remind us that the unknown is not an enemy, but a gift. Thank you for listening and for walking with me into this story. Until the next secret is opened, keep your eyes on the water, your heart open to the questions, and remember, some mysteries are not meant to end, only to be carried,